Alnoor Ladha, welcome to the new school.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
You suggested we call this conversation mystical anarchism. What does that mean to you?
Well, they're two unlikely words that in combination, and the two words most people are triggered by. And I think that's always a good place to start. The idea of mysticism is just really about the idea of direct dialogue and direct relationship to the divine. And in some ways, I think it's a more palatable word than spirituality, which has been, co-opted and abused and all of those things. So it's a non-institutional spirituality, non-dogmatic and pathless for all intents and purposes. And anarchism is equally polarizing for different reasons. Anarchism is not anarchy. Anarchism is actually a very sophisticated political philosophy that is about subsidiarity of power, bringing power to where decisions are actually made. It's about localization of communities. It's about self-organization. And it's really about creativity and the human will and the community's will to decide what is best for them. And so it's not outside of law. It's I think more, let's say, more tuned to etiquette than it is to law, right? Etiquette is pre-law, it's pre-morality, it's pre-literacy. It's a way of being that is in right relation to other human beings, to nature, to the spirits, to the more than human world that exists. And so I like putting mysticism and anarchism together because the left has lost its spiritual center. God died for the left in the 1800s. And Marxism, dialectical historicism, socialism, they're all reactions against institutional religion, and for good reason. And so as a result, though, they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And the spiritual movements, we won't talk about institutional religion because we know where that has led us. But let's say the New Age movement, for example, lacks a political analysis and an understanding of power and the context we're in as a civilization. And they believe enlightenment is an individual pursuit. And so I think merging these two ideas of spirituality and politics, mysticism and anarchism, is a good starting place for dialogue. Not to say that I have any answers, because that would go against both the mystical and anarchist traditions of self-sovereignty and individual agency and collective responsibility.
You live in a community in Costa Rica that is germane to this conversation. Could you tell us a little about it?
Yeah, it's very early days. So we've been there for about 3 years in the northwest jungle of Costa Rica. It's not where we wanted to end up. In some ways, it was the last place we wanted to be, because we just thought there's so many alternative communities and healing centers, and let's go do it somewhere more difficult. And we thought we would do it in upstate New York, where we were living in New York at the time. And in retrospect, that was just hubris. Because as easy as it is to, for example, learn how to farm in a place like Costa Rica, if it was any more difficult, we wouldn't be able to do it, because we were socialized in urban contexts. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is create the conditions for relearning and remembering the basic aspects of being human and being free as much as one can in a interdependent world, but more free from the power structure and the oxygen that we're all breathing, which is neoliberal capitalism.
It's called Tierra Valiente, or Brave Earth. Yes? Yeah. It's about 3 years now.
It's about 3 years. And
how many people are there now?
There's about 40 of us right now. Mm-hmm. It'll grow to be about 80 adults and 20 kids or something like that. It's not huge. Our piece of land is about 80 acres, and there's a broader 230-acre commons with the neighboring farms. Mm-hmm. And it's really a community of healers and activists and artists who want to live outside the traditional system. So there's no money exchanged among the people who live there. It's gift only. The land is put into a trust. The income that does come from the retreat center and the surplus of farming is run through a co-op. So profit sharing, joint decision making, no distinction between labor and capital. So if you were
one person, one vote.
One person, one vote. So whether you were one of the founders or you're a farmer, you have equal vote, equal profit share, etc.
You said something very interesting to me in our conversation over lunch before we began about how the community handles one of the things that tears community apart, which is erotic relationships. How do you do that there?
So I think this is one of the underbellies of our culture that is actually not an underbelly, right? It's so central to human life, but it's shunned upon to be discussed in public fora. And part of that is very deep Judeo-Christian Islamic programming and repression. And our perspective is I don't believe in, and I'm not going to speak for the community because, again, that would breach mystical anarchist etiquette. But I personally don't believe in either polyamory or monogamy. I just believe in truth and context. Monogamy, as to say I am monogamous before understanding the context of a relationship that evolves over 10 years or 20 years is a pre-decision. And from a spiritual perspective, to decide on what your arrangement is going to be without understanding the context or the omens or what your ancestors say or how people evolve is basically telling the universe you don't trust it. And I'm not against monogamy as a consequence of a relationship that's in dialogue and evolving, of course. Like, who would say no to that? But to have it as a foregone conclusion before the exploration even starts, there's something odd about that, and you also something sinister, which is why institutional religion and the state deem it so important. It's why you get tax breaks for doing it, because it makes you complacent and it binds you to the state and to a certain place, and it makes you a better taxpayer, essentially, or a tithe payer. And the issue with polyamory I have is it's just another form of consumption, right? Everyone is just, it's a form of hedonism and commodification. And so I believe in truth and context, and in the right context, who knows what humans are capable of. But to create an environment where we at least speak about that and where you're held accountable. And so sometimes I joke that I'm omniamorous. I'm in love with the divine, and that's our primary relationship, to use polyamory language, right? Because they have their primary partners. Our primary relationship for all of us is with the divine. How could it be any other way? And the divine speaks to us through multiple mirrors and in multiple ways. And so what we try to do is just create a safe space to have that dialogue and to hold each other accountable. And so instead of pretending we are a certain way and then having our sort of secret outlets of guilt and shame, rather it's let's just hold each other accountable to a set of principles that you yourself have determined, and we as the community are essentially just co-counseling and co-facilitating with you. And to also say a couple's relationship is not their private matter, and that's what we're told in atomized Western society, that what happens in your family unit is your own business, but it affects everyone, and it affects the energetic field. And so if people are unhappy, rather than staying unhappy in their pair-bonded situation, it's better to come to the community and just discuss what's happening. And it doesn't mean we have any say on their the way in which they handle the situation, but at least they can get multiple mirrors. And also just to contextualize this, to say this is not our primary inquiry.
No, I understand
right?
that, but since it's an important part of being human.
Yeah, it is an important part.
And I found it fascinating that you raised it in our conversation as a piece of it. So Speaking of relationship with the divine, I believe that you come from a Sufi family. Is that true?
I do,
And
yeah.
you were born in Vancouver. Is that correct? Vancouver, Canada. Tell us a little about your family of origin. Where were you born, and what was your family?
My family on both my mom's side and dad's side are from East Africa. My mom's family is from Zanzibar, the island off of Tanzania. And my dad's family are from Uganda. They're part of the same tribe, the Ismailis. The Ismailis,
Yeah.
The assassin order, is also what they're known as. And they migrated from Arabia to Egypt, and they were the caliphs during the Fatimid period, and then they migrated to Persia after the fall of Cairo, and then were in exile in Persia for 500 to 700 years, and then some migrated to India, and then Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan and India. And so my dad's family followed that migration pattern. And my mom's family ended up in East Africa, in Zanzibar. And my dad was exiled in 1972 by Idi Amin, if you know the Idi Amin story. And my mom was a midwife in the UK at the time. And yeah, they just randomly met in Vancouver. And I guess not so randomly. And of course, being of the same community, there was ways to meet. And yeah, we were all born there and socialized by Canadians.
How many children?
Three brothers, all boys. Yeah.
And the Ismaili tribal community is an extraordinary community.
In some ways they are, and in some ways they've sort of calcified their belief system. So they went from a very mystical Sufi sect to being a sort of commercial sect, and that happened through an alliance with the British Empire. They've always been in exile, and I think that created a deep insecurity. And so when the proximity to power happened in 17th century Persia, they essentially sold out their values. And if you look at the Ismaili community today, most of them are pursuing commercial interest. There's their fair share in academia, etc. They're very successful, quote unquote, in rationalist, materialist terms. But the Aga Khan of the time, who's their imam, their pope, if you listen to what he says, he really pushes them to be successful in the countries they live in because they're mostly immigrants. There's no homeland. And so I understand the strategy, right? Because it's a strategy of integration, and he understands that there's a capitalist environment, and if you're successful within that environment, you're seen as worthy. But at the same time, there is no point of view on climate change, our current crisis, the context we're in, and the old immigrant ideal of pursuing wealth in order to have your overlord's approval doesn't make sense in this context. We have 10 years, maybe 20 years left of the Western way of living. And so I have a strong critique of them in that sense, from an economic perspective, and I also think spiritually. If you come from the space where this mystical tradition, which the Ismailis do, and you say, well, the aim of our spiritual practice is to enter unity consciousness. Well, then the path to get you to that unity consciousness, if that itself calcifies and institutionalizes and creates a context in which you spend the majority of your time with your own community, your alms and your charity and your generosity is focused on that community, you are therefore creating separation. And the initial intent of unity consciousness is defeated by the tribalism that you've created. And so if our circle of empathy is not expanding through our spiritual practice, then what are we doing?
We're going to follow two threads here and dance back and forth between them, because I do, as I told you, want to do a spiritual biography here. And so we're launched in that into your family of origin and the Ishmaeli tribe and its loss of its origin of seeking the divine in unity and becoming more commercial in exile. But since you've raised your sense that we have 10 or 20 years left, what is your analysis of where we are in this world today?
There's multiple ways to answer this, and maybe the way I will go is through the historic lens, because I think it's important to presence that and say, I don't believe that there was some homeostasis of Eden, some perfect place that we left. But I do think that there was a time where we were living in deep symbiosis with nature. We were living in small hunter-gatherer tribal communities, which were, and we know this from cultural anthropology and evolutionary anthropology and biology and psychology, that we were living in largely peaceful tribes with very little hierarchy, living quite leisurely lives, and the average working time was 10 hours a week. From bone density samples, we know we were having roughly 2,000 calories a day. There was no sort of chief in that sense that was the accumulator of all goods, the way we have now. And Marshall Salins calls this the original affluent society. And the discovery, if you want to call it that, or of farming and the Neolithic Revolution that led to sedentary lifestyle created a situation in which we sort of tamed nature, if you will. We extracted. And we were not of place in the same way. We didn't go to the mother for our nourishment and bounty. We started to believe it was our own ingenuity that led to our being fed. And that disconnection, that original disconnection, that is the fall from Eden in some ways. And not to say we want to go back to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but we don't want to go back to the Paleolithic, but we want to learn to be of the Paleolithic, in the sense that there were psychic powers that we had, there was a remembering that we had, and I think a lot of the grief we hold right now is also a grief of being born into a culture where that no longer exists. And so the situation we're now in is, from we know that the first physical structures were ziggurats and places where we held the surplus of farming. And as soon as you have a surplus, you then have some kind of military to protect that surplus, and then a hierarchy that manages that armed force. And then it's symbolized in the ziggurat itself, where the high priests, where the king or sun king or emperor was at the top, and then the high priests, and then the military class, and then the lower castes were at the bottom, and that hierarchical structure is the antithesis to a biomimetic social structure that mirrors nature and mirrors harmony and mirrors life. And so where we are, from Ur and Babylon to modern times is a very short period of time. And it didn't just happen in that way. We had a set of contextual factors, which is that type of hierarchical structure rewards psychosis, right? That's essentially what it does. If you are good at manipulation and hoarding power and selfishness and greed and avarice, you climb up that hierarchy. And so this is the birth of patriarchy. And men being physically stronger and less intelligent in ways that matter, were rewarded in that system. And again, that's not to say it's the fault of males, right? Because it's much more complex than that, right? You have a social structure that we were all invested in that created those types of outcomes. And then you amplify that with monotheism, which is a form of fascism. How could it be anything else when you say that there's only one way to the divine, and it's this way that came from this prophet in this particular time? So the marriage of hierarchy, a cultural system that rewarded psychosis, married with monotheistic religion and the invention of guns, germs, and steel, and other sort of military innovations, created the context that brought us to the situation where we're now, as Wendell Berry says, we are a species out of context. And so we're now in this place where we know our industrial activity, i.e. globalized capitalism, is creating climate change. Climate change is not man-made, as we're told, it's capital-made. Every dollar of wealth created is heating up the planet. Every dollar of wealth created, 93, 94 cents ends up in the hands of the top 1%. So by definition, capitalism creates inequality. It creates poverty. It creates climate change. And it is, these are not externalities. These are the logical outcomes of the Neolithic Revolution. These are the logical outcomes of hierarchy, of patriarchy, of disconnection from nature. And the state we're in is, it's an evolve or die moment for us as a civilization and as a species. And I think that's the place we're now at.
10 years ago, I think it was, you founded an organization called The Rules. Is that? Mm-hmm. And you've just been closing it now. Tell us about The Rules and why it relates to what we've just been talking about.
So The Rules started in 2012. So at the end of this year will be 8 years, and we close. But when we started, we said we'd close after 10 years of the organization. And then in 2015, we reevaluated and decided to close at the end of this year. Mm-hmm. And for multiple reasons, but just to say what we do first, maybe. Mm-hmm. When we started, it was a post-Occupy world. A few of us met at Occupy in 2011, and we saw both the power of decentralized citizen movements, and we also saw the paralysis that comes with horizontalism, and being united on a sort of political critique, but not having a spiritual basis for the world we want to see, and having no real point of view on what does the post-capitalist world look like. And we didn't pretend to have the answer. We just said, let's go into inquiry together on what the alternatives are and what the post-capitalist worlds, in plural, could be. And we started an organization that sort of did three things. We had a think tank arm that sole aim was to get more radical ideas into the mainstream and make them feel like common sense. So we did an exploration of alternatives like universal basic income, regenerative agriculture, post-growth economics, and then worked with cognitive linguistics and memetics and evolutionary theory and other ideas and tried to tell the best argument of why those ideas are important.
We called the Memetics Institute, right?
At a point it was called the Memetics Institute, and it sort of evolved, and it sort of now spun out into its own cooperatively run consultancy called Culture Hack Labs.
Okay.
Which I sit on the board of, but I'm not.
And that will continue?
And that will continue,
okay.
Yeah. And a few organizations have sort of come out, and non-organizations really. And then the other part was an organizing arm that worked directly with social movements, largely peasant movements, farmer movements, indigenous movements, largely in the global south, to create connective tissue and to say that it doesn't matter if you're fighting a pipeline in North Dakota or your land is being displaced by a World Bank project in Kenya or Monsanto in Latin America. We're all being affected by the logic of neoliberal capitalism, and it's not an us versus them, one bad guy versus, it's the logic of a system which is articulated by a set of rules that are generative, and these rules are man-made, and I don't say human-made, they're man-made and therefore can also be changed. And
So hence the name The Rules.
hence the name The Rules.
In other words, the idea was that there are a set of rules that are the logical way that late-stage capitalism works.
Expresses
right?
itself.
And expresses itself. And you were interested in discovering how those rules could be changed to create a sustainable and just world.
Exactly. And how they could also be exposed and disrupted. And then the third aspect which connects them is we ran a program called the Activist Ashram, which was a fellowship for frontline organizers, largely movement leaders and what we call the young elders in these movements. And they weren't NGO people. They were people who were working 2 jobs or whatever to be their community organizer and to really do that important resistance work. And so we wanted to give them some funding so they could be free for a year, and to bring them together twice a year for an opening circle and a closing circle to share their wisdom and other ways of knowing and being. And so that was more of a spiritual fellowship, if you will. And this sort of shared practice, everything from meditation techniques to personal self-care to plant medicine traditions that came from their regions, to really create that type of relational tissue, if you will, as white blood cells to what was happening in the world. And in many ways, I see that spiritual work as the central work, even though it might not have been our primary focus. It sort of infused every other aspect of the work, whether it was the think tank work, the organizing work, or the fellowship work.
Are you going to leave the website up for a while? Because I think it's a beautiful website.
We're going to do a new site that goes live at the end of this year. That'll have case studies and some documentaries.
It's a beautiful website, therules.org.
Thank you.
And people presumably will be able to link through that to whatever the
exactly.
is.
Exactly.
I thought let me just back up for a moment. After I met you and just thought you're the most gifted servant of life. And so I asked a few people in New York who knew you from your days with a prior organization in New York where you were doing political strategy work for the movement. And I would say to people, so do you know Alnoor Ladha? And people's basic response was, he's an incredibly smart guy, and he was really good at what he was doing, and I don't know what he's doing now. That was kind of the New York take. And but one of the things that struck me that was, I thought, strategically so powerful was that when you founded The Rules, you didn't do what most people would do, which would be to select different NGOs around the world to work with. You decided to work with popular movements. And to me, there is such intelligence and brilliance in that. And I want to ask you to say a little bit about how you came to the decision to work with popular movements as opposed to NGOs, and to give us some examples of what that work actually was and how that worked out.
This is why I often say that the people, especially in the spiritual community, will say to me, well, what's the most important thing I can do? And the thing I always say is understand how neoliberalism works. Understand how capitalism works, because it is the very oxygen in which we are breathing. It has intermediated every aspect of our lives. Just think about our priorities, our focus, what we do, why we do it, the role money plays, and money is just an invention, right? Debt-based capital is just an invention. Compound interest is just an invention. And so to not study these things is insane to me. And so spending time studying how capitalism works, the primary logic of capitalism is very similar to monotheism. It is a form of primacy. It's a monoculture. If we look at what the logical outcome of capitalism would be, we would all be wearing Nike shoes and having Apple computers and Microsoft Office and listening to Beyonce or whatever, the corporate music world wants us to listen to. It just funnels into this sort of monopoly corporate power, and it's a flywheel effect. It feeds itself. And so the more power certain corporations have, the more they can buy the political process through money and politics, the more they can exploit labor, change laws to further exploit labor laws and environmental laws, and find the cheapest labor wherever they are in the world. And so the cycle just speeds itself up. And so the antidote to monoculture is polyculture. Many ways of being, many ways of knowing, many tongues. And so when we started to understand that and see that, we thought, well, where is the sort of polyculture resistance? Where's the sort of animistic impulse for life that goes against the 5 M's of the apocalypse?
M's?
Yeah, monotheism, monoculture, monotony, monogamy, and I'm blanking on the 5th, but we'll call them the 4.
Money.
Yeah, and perhaps money itself. Yeah. That really, when you think of it that way, the place to look is popular resistance, because that's where the intelligence is. And so the first thing we wanted to do was support indigenous movements and indigenous resistances that were doing this work, and also understanding one of those 5 M's is monoculture, and food is sort of central to this struggle. And in some ways, the most radical act we can do is grow our own food, because the entire globalized capitalist system is dependent on making you disintermediated from where your food comes from. And it's interesting, right? A lot of progressive people will say, I'm going to stop flying. And it's like, well, actually, our primary objective should be stopping the flow of goods and services globally. That's why climate change is happening. That's how capitalism works. Whether you fly or not is really insignificant. Even if everyone stopped flying, that's less than 5% of emissions. Whereas the food sector, just in food production, is probably 40%, right? And then about 25% in the transportation of those goods and services around the world, right? And so we started working with farmer movements and peasant movements, and understanding their struggle for food sovereignty, and from that led to understanding the struggle of landless peoples movements and other popular movements.
So how do you give us one example of how you have worked with such a movement? What did it actually look like?
Yeah. So a good example is part of the work has been to understand the rules at the global level, right? Understanding how this oxygen works, and then also being in solidarity with the majority. And a good example of that was through the tax justice work. And so when we started to diagnose and dissect the way capitalism works, one way the flywheel effect I was talking about of corporate power happened is not just money in politics and exploiting labor and changing laws and all of that. It's through not paying tax, right? The majority of corporations do not pay tax. That's why outside of their home country, which is largely Western Europe or the United States. And that's why the sort of state corporate complex is so deep, because as long as they're paying tax at home, part of the neo-imperialism is you go and do whatever you want anywhere else, and the revenue still stays at home. And what's interesting is if you look at something like development, so-called development, that sort of Gates and Bono and USAID and all these people sort of pretend is a form of philanthropy, you see the way cash flow really works, right? So all of aid from rich countries to poor countries is about $120 billion a year. That's what they call OAD, Overseas Assistance Development. Just in tax evasion, these so-called developing countries are losing about $1.2 trillion a year. So 10 times all of aid just in tax evasion. So the same countries that are giving money to these so-called poor countries are protecting and encouraging their corporations to avoid tax through transfer mispricing and a whole sort of other complex things. And when you follow the money, you realize the center of this empire is the City of London. And the City of London Corporation, it's a private corporation, is the square mile. It's what they call, the square mile is their version of Wall Street. And it's privately owned. You could see it as the Vatican of wealth extraction. It's where all 14 major banks have their head offices. It's run in an old sort of council system. They have aldermen and councilmen. They have their own mayor, which is the Lord Mayor of London, who's separate to the Mayor of London. And we started doing a campaign on exposing the City of London Corporation and saying, you want to talk about corruption in the global south and tin pot dictators, but the world's corruption is created and enabled by the global north through this tax haven system. So all the tax havens, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, etc., the reason they're tax havens is because they're backed by the Queen. And they're exempt for that reason. So they're part of this sort of tentacle empire. And then we started following the activity of the Lord Mayor of London, and we realized he's essentially the lobbyist in chief for the global tax haven system. That's his job. He goes around creating more tax havens so the spider web gets more complex and it's harder to track the money. And in the end, about 60% of the world's wealth flows through the City of London because of this tax haven system. And so we found out he was pushing, he had meetings with Kenyatta, who was at the time trying to get into power in Kenya. His father was the former prime minister. And so in 2012 and 13, he had multiple meetings with Kenyatta. And after Kenyatta came into power, he announced there's going to be this sort of tax-exempt area of Kenya where major corporations could have their home base and not pay tax. And this is how they get away with it, right? They pretend they're in the job creation business when they're really in the extraction business. And the power elite of that country know that and have that relationship and are allowing them to do it. So it's not just a north-south thing, it's a 1%er thing, And so we started watching this and what they were doing with the sort of special tax zones, and then all of a sudden he announced that there was going to be a 16% value-added tax, basically on staple items for poor people, maize, flour, corn. So essentially what they were doing was giving tax breaks to the rich and asking the poor to carry the load. And that was the deal that Kenyatta had made with the Lord Mayor of London in order to get into power. And so we were just watching this situation and connecting the dots, and we had hired an investigative journalist, a very well-known investigative journalist in Kenya, to follow the Lord Mayor when he was in town and other things. And so we sort of released this research to some of the key movements in Kenya, and there was a sort of coalition that was born that came together called Kenyans for Tax Justice, and included everyone from big international think tanks like Tax Justice Network to community organizations like Bunge la Mama, the People's Parliament, the Women's Parliament, Bunge la Manancha, the People's Parliament, disability organizations, food rights organizations, farmer organizations, landless people's groups. And what happened is they created this umbrella organization called Kenyans for Tax Justice. And they basically, through community organizing, informed everyone in their respective communities what was actually happening. And there became a popular resistance against this tax. And we renamed the tax from VAT, which, value added doesn't sound like a bad thing, to unga tax. Unga's maize flour. It's something ordinary people just inherently understand. As soon as you're taxing their unga, it's, and it became this widespread popular movement, and the bill was killed. And so that's a good example of just supporting local movements, connecting to what's happening at the global level, and also creating a sense of empathy that we're all being affected by the globalization and concentration of power, which is essentially what's happening.
So how many experiences like that with significant policy outcomes that helped people would you say that the rules engaged in over the 8 years that it's been active?
You know, it's interesting. Even telling you that last story, I don't believe in success.
No, I understand.
Yeah, in that way, we're obviously losing
I'm
the
just
battle,
trying to get
right?
an order of magnitude sense, because your analysis to me is deeply sophisticated. I'm not talking about a success, but I'm talking about, I asked you for an example, you gave me an example. If we had the time, I could ask you for a set of other examples, but what my curiosity then is, to what degree did you learn, let's put it that way, over this 8-year period, that this approach could be truly helpful in other contexts?
I would say probably a handful of times there's been moments where we realized like the power of this, what we call culture hacking work, which is not traditional campaigning. It's not advocacy work. It's not, appeal to the person in power sort of model of social change. It's more about changing the cultural climate in which these things are happening. And so if ordinary people just don't accept there could be a tax on Unga, that's just not going to happen. And that's going to upset the Lord Mayor's plans and Kenyatta's plans, and it's going to, and then you have to be responsive to that and what happens next. But I would say for every time this has been, we've learned from it and we see the power of it, there's been a handful of times where it's been unsuccessful and it doesn't work. And part of it is just testing and reiterating and also realizing that our best thinking got us here. And so to not be attached to one way of doing anything, and also to be in the humility of knowing that we are failing, if you want to use such extreme dichotomous words, in the bigger battle, and at the same time there is no linearity, and so the cause and effect of what we're doing is forced in order to have those conversations with funders and other people where you have to explain what you do. And it's like, I believe in more of a quantum ethics, entanglement and co-agency and context. And there's so many forces at play. And to say that we did that, which is what funders want you to say, and that's how fundraising happens. But it goes against our moral code, which is, it just doesn't work like that. It's you can be part of something, but you don't affect change in that way.
You were kind enough to introduce me to the editor of Cosmos, and I wrote a piece for them, which I was grateful to you for doing. And I was looking at the pieces that you have written for Cosmos, and one is called Grief, Collapse, and Mysticism, and another is called Seeing Watiko, a word I don't know, Capitalism, Mind Virus, and Antidotes for a World in Transition, and then a piece on mystical anarchism. So let me just take a few minutes to talk about an analysis that both of us are somewhat involved with, which some people think about as the civilizational collapse theory, and others people say it's not going to collapse, but it's going to drastically change. But the basic analysis is that we're facing far more than climate change. Climate change is not only true, but sucking the oxygen out of the room for everything else that's going on. Some people get to the point where they talk about climate change and poverty or injustice as the two things. But the way many of us look at it is that there are all the environmental stressors, there are the social stressors, and there are the technological stressors, maybe 24 to name a number. And that these 24 stressors interacting in completely unpredictable ways have created a perfect storm in which, as there's a wonderful quote from the science fiction writer William Gibson, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. So we have these countries that are clearly in complete collapse now, whole regions, almost whole continents in collapse. And then we have other countries that are, or regions that are degrading very rapidly. And, there are serious scientific debates right now about whether of the 9 billion people on Earth, 1 billion will be alive in another 20 years, And that's being seriously debated. I mean, honestly, seriously debated. So the question becomes, there are multiple questions. One is, when we talk about this, there are a lot of people just want to run screaming from the room. They don't want to have anything to do with it. They're either in denial about it, or it hurts too much to think about, or they've got more important things to think about in their lives. There are other people who, for whatever reasons, are designed to look at this stuff. They're just designed to look at this stuff. I happen to be one of the people who is designed to look at this. You happen to be one of the people who's designed to look at this. And so here we are. There's been some important work done. In fact, I think it was in the Atlantic, could have been in Harper's, about people who know too much about the climate scientists and what it's like for them to live with what they know. But if you're talking about the people who are living with the civilizational collapse scenario, my God, it's not just those two things, it's the whole enchilada. And so you and I are going to speak at a funder meeting in the next few days, and my little pocket message to funders has been, there are tens of thousands of foundations and hundreds of thousands of NGOs working on every important silo issue under the sun, but there are very few foundations and very few NGOs that are looking at the whole enchilada. And in fact, if we don't look at the whole enchilada, we will be far less prepared to survive this bottleneck that all of life is coming through. Biodiversity, humanity, there's this bottleneck, and we're entering it. And, what is it, 3 billion birds lost in North America since 1970, insect Armageddon all over. We could just multiply all the examples. So there are many questions that this raises. For one thing, it raises deep psychological and spiritual questions about not only how do we live with this, but what do we tell our children? How do we communicate with our children, with our communities? How do we speak the truth about what is happening, and at the same time create an environment where one can live with some hope and some peace of mind about what we're moving into, without denying it in any way? So there's the psycho-spiritual dimension of it. And then there's the question of, what does resilience look like? What does it look like for the family level? What does it look like at the community level? What does it look like at the regional level, national, global, and so on and so forth? So I'm just opening that up because you and I are going to be speaking about this with Pete Myers and another friend in a few days. And I'm curious, how do you hold this, and how can you imagine the exploration that can lead us toward a deeper way of being with this?
That's a beautiful question. In some ways, the only question. Right?
It is.
And I feel like partly what's happening right now to us culturally is that we're being initiated into non-dualistic thought. To be able to hold not just two, but multiple perspectives simultaneously. And, in the Vedic traditions, they call this period that we're in the Kali Yuga.
The Kali Yuga, right.
The Dark Ages. And what's interesting about the Dark Ages is it's not, we just know the shorthand of Kali Yuga, but if you look at the texture around what is said about the Kali Yuga, it's the point of bifurcation. So it is the strongest amount of darkness and psychosis and shadow, but also the most amount of light and the most amount of assistance we get from interdimensional beings and spirits and guides and ancestors and all of that. And so that itself is a non-dualistic thought. It's simultaneous extreme shadow and extreme light. And that's why many of us go through these sort of waves and cycles of feeling bliss we've never felt and meeting people that we feel so connected to in a period of time that used to take us 10 years to get to where we get to in evenings sometimes now, And then we turn on the television and we see Trump, Putin, Netanyahu, and the deepest level of despair, right, sort of simultaneously engulfs us. And this is an initiation into non-dualistic thought. And I don't think it's just some people. Okay, clearly there are going to be people who are better trained because of history, epigenetics, disposition, etc., in non-dualistic thought, but we're all going to be initiated into non-dualistic thought, whether we like it or not. And it's not just non-dualistic thought; it's non-dualistic embodiment. It's being able to live and be in relationship to multiple truths simultaneously. And what that is going to require is a very deep unlearning and deprogramming of everything we think we know and everything we've been socialized into being. And that includes the things we hold on to hardest, like our religiosity, our belief in what the family unit should be, our belief in what gives us safety. Because it's actually these desires that are creating the system we live in. It's our desire for the comfort of continuing to live the way we live. You know, George Bush, American way of life is not up for question. And well, it's like, if you're negotiating with Mother Earth, I think it is, whether you like it or not. And so part of the birth canal that we are in is going to be a deep dissolution of our identities and our old programming and patterns. And yes, this can be painful, and at the same time, it doesn't have to be. And that's just a non-dualistic thought. And it's both the deepest levels of grief and gratitude simultaneously. They're just the two hands of prayer, as Francis Weller says. That's what grief and gratitude are, and this is the sort of point in the birth canal where we have to sort of transcend the subject-object duality to see that there is no other, and also be deeply rooted in our cultures, be deeply rooted in our prayers, be deeply rooted in our ancestral relationships, because they're living through us, and this is partly what's happening. Is we're all in the redemption business of some sort, and that is happening through the way in which we're living our lives. And what the external, if you want to call it context, or you want to, it's so much bigger than context. Even the idea of nature is problematic because the language itself implies some separation. And so what the context or the womb that we're in is showing us is everything we thought we believed has to disintegrate in order for a new way to be born. It doesn't mean we won't get back to the same place. The things that we believe are important to us may very well be where we end up again. And when I look at that, I see aspects of the way we live, like cooperation and partnership and altruism and generosity and kindness. And I don't think those things are going to be dissolved on the other side of this catastrophe. I think we're going to be brought closer to whatever impulse in us had that in the first place. And what it also requires is shifting our relationship from one of abstraction, which has come from scientific, materialist, rationalist thought, to one of deep immersion and one of deep animism, where we see the living planet and the living universe as not outside of us, but we are in dialogue with it. And these are just omens. And the end of this story does not have to be catastrophe, because that's just another linear thought. Miracles of all sorts can happen. Spontaneous evolution of all types could happen. But what it does require is being able to go into this animistic field that is actually our natural language. You know, we are naturally that way outside of the programming of sort of rationalist linear thought. And also to be in the relativism, to understand that everything is relative to everything else. That's what it is that's the definition of interdependence. And so, and the other aspect is also the commodification that comes with selfishness. So as soon as we are doing something for the end of self-gain, that's just going to contribute to where we are. So all those shadow aspects of ourselves are just being mirrored back to us, and we're essentially being shown that we can no longer live that way. And one way to comprehend the climate catastrophe is grief, and we could stay in that, or we could say grief is a necessary emotion in order for us to allow parts of ourselves to die, to then also be in the gratitude for the parts of ourselves that are being born. And that's the non-dualistic approach. That's a non-dualistic approach to collapse.
So I heard you say something profound, significant. And please correct me if I do not remember this accurately. You said this does not have to end in catastrophe. This does not have to end in catastrophe. You said that the grief about climate and everything else is a necessary component, but we don't want to be stuck there. There are parts of us that are dying. There are parts of us that are being born. And that if we hold it that way, that this period of Kali Yuga, which we think of only as the darkest age, we miss the equal power of the light, that all kinds of miracles are possible and happening, and that all kinds of forces, of many of which we don't have any notion, are there to come to our assistance. Yeah? All right. So, in your new community, Brave Earth, what do you say to the children about what is happening? In language a child can understand. Suppose that instead of us in the room, you had a group of 8 to 12-year-olds, and they were saying to you, Alnoor, you have thought a lot about this. We see, like, as you know, over the last 2 days, children have been marching all over the world about the climate crisis. What would you say to the children?
Yeah, I like to start with first principles. And what I would say is when we access reality, what we realize is there's actually only one of us. That's what all the mystical truths lead to. And so we are in multiple form, in multiple beings, and the thing that is happening is bigger than any one individual mind can understand. And that's okay. No one has the answer. Even the idea of us sitting here and the idea of expertise or the idea of the student and the teacher is problematic. And it doesn't mean it's not true. It's, again, one truth. And the student and the teacher and the guru and the disciple, these things are just happening simultaneously. And it's just roles and functions we're playing. And so I would explain the story in that way. Not to say that there is other, but there is also other. And in the story of what's happened, there are people who are benefiting from the system. The story of Kalki How many of you are familiar with Kalki? Yeah. So Kalki is the 10th and final incarnation of Vishnu. So in the Vedic tradition, in the Hindu texts, Krishna was the third or fourth incarnation of Vishnu. You know, there's the tripartite system, the three major deities, Brahma, the first breath, Shiva, the destroyer, and Vishnu, the sustainer. And Vishnu comes 10 times on earth in various forms. And one of those was Krishna, who's the Christ of the Vedic tradition. And in his 10th and final form, he comes as Kalki. And Kalki rides a white horse, and he has a light sword, and he chops the heads off all the capitalists. This is actually the yantra of Kalki. And
so what you're showing us, you just rolled up your sleeve, and on your elbow, or on the inner side of your elbow, whatever that part of our body is called, you have this yantra.
Yeah, it's the yantra of Kalki.
The yantra of Kalki.
And the yantra is just a visual mantra.
Right.
And so, but Kalki is non-dual in his thought, right? Because Kalki understands that he's just chopping off the heads of other parts of himself. Because there is no other. When you access reality at the highest level of unity consciousness, there is only this one divinity expressing itself in all these other forms. But that doesn't mean there's not agency. And that's what we have to understand. That's the non-dual thought, which is we can't spiritually bypass and say, well, there's only oneness. Well, there's only oneness, and some people are more responsible than others, and some people are benefiting more than others. And I think that's actually important to tell children, you know, to be, not to treat them as children or not to treat them as students, but to bring them into the initiation of non-dual thought very early on. And that's what the great mythology always did. And what we started doing, largely because of Western materialist rationalist thought, which is largely operates in metaphor, we started taking our metaphors literally and started using metaphor to separate, right? And to say, well, oh, that's a character in a play, instead of that's just an aspect of you. If you look at ancient animistic tradition, even Western European tradition, you know, the Vikings were not praying to Thor. When they were spear fishing in the fjords, they just became Thor. That was the point of inventing God. And you know, even the Old Testament says, "I am that which is becoming," and I think that's the story to tell children, is that evolution is not happening outside of us. So it's almost making them take responsibility for what is happening, and they can also say it was your generation who did this, and that's also true. It's sort of there's that old Ram Dass line where he says the universe is perfect, including my desire to change it. Mm-hmm. That these things are not happening outside of us. So you can try to comprehend the story on an intellectual level, and you can try to say, well, what's the causality, and who are the actors, and whose fault is it? Mm-hmm. And the answer is both. It's your fault as an incarnate being, and there are people who benefited more than others from the Kali Yuga. Mm-hmm. That's just the nature of oneness playing out the cosmic drama in multiple forms. And so does that answer the question?
That's good.
Sort of, in an abstract.
But it raises another question.
Yeah.
You are suggesting to the children that they understand themselves as both the separate entities, but also this oneness. Mm-hmm. And you described how the Vikings, when they were stabbing the fish in the fjords, didn't pray to Thor, they became Thor. And you have this yantra on your arm that is the yantra of, what's the word?
Kalki.
Kalki, who comes on his white horse with a white sword and chops off the heads of the capitalists. So my personal question to you, because this is a spiritual biography, mm-hmm. is, do you experience the force of Kalki or some other trans-personal entity within yourself?
I think there's also a time to pray to beings outside of yourself. It's not just all embodiment. Again, it's non-dualistic thought. And so, do I pray to Kalki? Yeah. And I also pray to Kali, because I think it's also her time. And I also pray to Allah and to cosmic consciousness itself, and to the spirits, and to the elements, and to interdimensional beings and extra-dimensional beings, and for assistance right now. Do I want to play the role of Kalki? No. I believe in nonviolence. Would I observe Kalki chopping off the heads of those who benefit, including myself? Yes. Would I take satisfaction in that? Well, I don't know what state of being I'd be in while I'm in observance of that.
So how do you pray?
I think it's a highly personal act, and
You can say no.
Yeah, no. It just depends. I'm a big believer in contextual truth. And this is why the idea of a church or a mosque was always anathema to me, which was they were telling me how to pray, and that makes no sense to a mystic, because in the Sufi tradition, we talk a lot about walking prayer. That the point of prayer is not to create a sequestered part of your life while you are praying to something outside of you. It's just to be in awareness that you are Allah becoming self-aware. Your consciousness becoming self-aware, and that is a process. And one way to access that process can be dance and music and tantra and eros, and another way could be to pray for other beings, which is a very strong part of the Sufi tradition. How do you walk into a room and pray for every being and their ancestors and their healing and their lineages and their karmic redemption, and also the wind and the moon and the stars and the ancestral forces, and all these seen and unseen and visible and invisible things happening in the context you're in all the time. And that's the practice of zikr. That's the practice of being in the mantra and being in the devotion. And for me, part of that practice is political work. I don't see the point in spiritual work outside of the application of that spiritual work to the context we're in. And there's that old Buddhist line that says, enlightenment does not happen in the cave, it happens in the mouth of the lion. Well, this is the mouth of the lion. This is the application of our spiritual work, is testing it in real time by trying to redress the imbalance of power in the world, and confronting your own demons and your own shadow that come up when you do political work. And this is what we see in the world of political activism is people are not willing to do that work. They're not willing to see how part of the crisis is how we as activists are responding to the crisis. And so all of a sudden we're in these general assemblies, and we're fighting with each other about nothing when we agree on 95% or more, ideological political premises. And it's partly because we see the political work as the end of the work, as opposed to the political work is the beginning of the spiritual work, and also the spiritual work is the beginning of the political work. Simultaneously, both of these things are true because they're feeding each other. Nothing is going to test you like a struggle. That's where your identity is born. It's very easy to meditate in the absence of a context, and the animate living universe is showing you a context, which is you have 10 years left to live in this way, and there's consequences to the way we're living. It's not just it's going to happen in 10 years like it's some external thing. Destruction is happening now. 200 species a day are going extinct now. And what are we doing about that? And the inner work is not enough. It's not to say we shouldn't do it, or of course, no. It's just the meditation is the prerequisite for the revolution.
So the piece that I'm missing now, that I hope to capture with you, is that we left your family of origin as the Ismaili family in Vancouver with 3 children, all boys. And we picked you up as you had done some important political work in New York, and then decided to create this Brave Earth community in Costa Rica, and created the rules as a way to engage with the neoliberal capitalist situation. And we've talked a little about how you hold yourself and life spiritually at this time. So the question I'd like to ask you is, how did you get from your family of origin to your current understanding? What were the major stages of spiritual evolution that you went through?
I guess I'm always hesitant to the idea of biography and story because it reifies the ego, right? In the sense that I am.
I know that, but you said in the rules that you're all about stories, right? Yeah. And us being humans, we respond to stories.
No, exactly. It's non-dual.
The audience that will listen to this
non-dual.
will be fascinated by your story. It's part of the deal.
That's part of the deal. So I think part of it was the rejection of Islam was a big part of the journey, essentially knowing, and I think we all know this, whatever tradition that we are born, even if it's an atheistic tradition, that we are fed half-truths. Mm-hmm. And that the sort of recognition that you are living in a culture of half-truth where the adults are lying to you, partly because they don't know better, is actually an important rite of passage in the Kali Yuga. Mm-hmm. And so, I recently said to a rabbi friend of mine, in the context of a joke, there was an ex-Muslim, an ex-rabbi, and an ex-Christian, and we had a Quechua man and a Lakota elder in the car. And he said, correction, not an ex-Muslim, ex-Christian, and an ex-Jew, a heretic Muslim, a heretic Jew, and a heretic Christian. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about his reframe is that we chose to incarnate in these lines, partly to hold them accountable for the fact that the initiation of these traditions was contextually relevant to their time only, and then they calcified the tradition. And so Muhammad made sense in 600 AD, and after he dies, what happens is the bastardization of his truths into an institutional religion for power and money and a role in the hierarchy and all the other benefits you had being a caliph. But there was also benefit in it, in the sense that the vibration that he could access when he entered unity consciousness could be spread at least breast to breast, at least person to person, not necessarily through scripture, but through embodiment. And it happened. There was a renaissance in the Middle East, and hundreds of tribes came together, and violence and war was alleviated. And Muhammad was a feminist, what most people don't know, and shifted the balance of power towards women in the culture, and all of those things. And they also, from my subjective perspective, just like capitalism, religion has passed its expiry date. And so also holding that truth in you, and I think both the sort of rejection of Islam and innately knowing that the sort of higher truth of unity consciousness that was originally embedded in the morphogenetic field of this culture had been violated, and then going to other paths. So I studied a lot of Taoism, and I was never that interested in Buddhism personally, but shamanism and going to the direct experience. And for me, the central pillar of that was the psychedelic experience. And realizing that the fear traditional religions have of the sacraments is that you wouldn't need the religion if you were actually in symbiosis with that plant.
So have you done a lot of the sacraments?
I would say a lot's a relative word, but I've done enough to be in reverence of plants and to see plants as my teachers. And I don't see it as a form of consumption, and I don't see it as a form of something that is outside of me. I do it within the spiritual container of reverence and respect for both the tradition that I do and don't believe in tradition simultaneously. Because I believe in etiquette, and part of the etiquette of approaching these plants and approaching these cultures is to do it in a way that you treat them as the way a Muslim or a Christian or Jew would treat God.
So, parenthesis here, but a significant one, because we are in this moment when Michael Pollan's book, Changing Your Mind, has come out. I did 2 New School conversations with Michael Pollan, and am also close friend of Robert Jesse, who's central to his book in terms of being the wise strategist behind a lot of the research that has brought about. And I would, without referencing anybody else, but it seems to me that quite a few of the people who are thoughtful about these sacraments right now have considerable concern about the explosion of interest in it, the commodification of it, if you will, and how it has the power to do great good. But as it moves through the culture as a whole, it will be ingested. These powerful medicines will be ingested by people whose personalities are not particularly well organized in different ways, and they may cause harm to themselves and harm to others. So because you're so aware of this key moment in human consciousness, the darkness and the light, and because the psychedelics have been a powerful dimension of your own accessing of truth, what is your counsel about how we should hold the power of these medicines as they disseminate widely through the culture?
Yeah, so I'm not a believer in legalization, but I do believe in decriminalization. I think what legalization, if you look at the MAPS world, you know, these the multidisciplinary, whatever, psychedelic society, and what they're trying to do with MDMA, for example, where that leads, we already have a test case in where that leads, right? We've seen what happens with marijuana. And what it does is it increases corporate power. It commodifies the morphogenetic field of that plant. And it gives access to people who are not initiated or not necessarily ready to commune with that plant. And so I think we should be, of course, pushing for decriminalization, and that this work should be kept sacred and outside of the realm of capitalism. I don't even think it necessarily should be charged for, though I understand in a neoliberal globalized society where we've gutted every other means of exchange, from barter to fishing to gifting, to that's necessary, and of course with the exploitation of indigenous peoples and genocide and etc. And then saying there's only one way to acquire goods and services, which is U.S. debt-based capital, that is going to happen. And so I think all we can really do is be very mindful and sensitive and aware of the logic of capital. That has to be the starting place for all of our analysis, spiritual or political. And the second thing we can do is to try to protect the indigenous cultures that hold these medicines. Because if they get decimated and we start accessing these medicines outside of the symbiotic 5,000 year, 10,000 year plus relationships that original peoples have with these medicines, then you're not in the container of that culture, and you're in the container of the broader culture, which is sick. You know, and you said you didn't know what the word Wetiko means. Wetiko is a First Nations North America, Turtle Island word for cannibalism.
Oh.
And it was literal cannibalism. And when they first met the Western Europeans and they came to their continent, the only word that they could come up with, that many tribes independently came up with and used to describe Western European culture, was Wetiko. It was a culture of cannibalism. They would eat their own children, including, you know, they saw rivers and trees and, you know, as their kin. And so as soon as the Wetiko sort of globalized consensus mainstream culture is the container in which these things are held, it's very dangerous. And of course, non-dualistically, those of us who are aware of that culture can navigate it. Mm-hmm. Because if you understand the logic of the system, it's not the point of knowing the logic of the system is not just to hold that knowledge, but it's to behave in an etiquette that is contextually relevant for that context.
I love the word etiquette that you're using. I love that very much.
You can't necessarily be in good etiquette if you don't understand the consequences of your action. And Stephen Jenkinson, for those who know Stephen Jenkinson, he was in the death trade. He was a hospice worker who sort of had evolution from seeing 1,000+ people die in his care. He says, he talks a lot about the etymology of words. And he says the root word of awake is not how New Age people think of awake as, you know, woke or conscious or whatever. It's comes from the same idea of the wake of a boat, the fanning out, and the A is an amplifier. So it's somebody who is, to be awake is to be so aware of the consequences of your action or actions. And so there's also a way to use duality, non-duality, to be able to live in the juxtaposition of working within a system that itself is destroying life and contributing to spiritual work that makes you feel whole. And in some ways that can be a comfortable position. But what I would say is that position is not going to last very long, and it's no one's work except your own to know when the omens present themselves to tell you that or to show you that the time is to evolve beyond that, and it will just happen. And there's also no way, one way, because how could there be, to be a revolutionary in this time? And some people will do it through the existing structure, and some people will do it outside the existing structure, and some people will do it just through embodiment. You'll just be in their presence, and you'll understand that their vibration is of such a signature that itself shifts you. And there is no right way to do it. But what I would say is, the sort of evolutionary work happens in the inquiry of the consequences of our action. And the most, quote unquote, awake people I know are so deeply sensitive to the consequences of their actions in every way. Like the way they prey on their food. They understand that an entire globalized supply chain and fossil fuels and slave labor and carbon emissions from having food shipped around the world came on this plate. And non-dualistically, they're simultaneously deeply appreciative of it to the point of reverence. And that, you can call that spirituality, or you can call that awareness of consequence. And that's the only thing I would sort of presence there.
So what have we not said yet that you would like to bring to the table before we close? Let me start, and I'll thank you again at the end, but I was so eager to do this with you, and I'm so grateful that we've done it, because for me it's a way of getting to know each other. And I just hold this incarnation of your being with such gratitude that you're here. And there are many aspects of your being, and like you, I'm an introvert. And like you, I deflect praise in all forms, not interested in it. But one of the things that I love about this incarnation of your being is your extraordinary gifts with the careful use of language. I have a friend named Tony Serra, who's an attorney in the Bay Area, who describes himself as a linguistic warrior. He's remarkable. He's taken care of all kinds of interesting people. And you remind me of that linguistic warrior. It's like that capacity. It's not just one word you use, but the whole syntax, the whole framework, this thought-out set of interactive ways of reconceptualizing reality feels so fresh to me. It has, I love like the way you played with the word awake. That's just a good example. It's not awake like conscious, it's like the wake, which is consciousness of consequence. Like that's just one example, but there are thousands and hundreds at least in the way you present things. So I come out of this conversation with a sense of being awakened in that sense, with a sense of the rippling consequences of being in the room with you for my own thought, for the thought of people who hear this. And not because people need to be anti-capitalist or, as you say, drop out or anything else, but simply we are facing this enormous, unprecedented world change. We're facing it. We're in it. There aren't that many people who are fully aware of it. And even a tiny proportion of those who are aware of it have begun to do the kind of inner and outer work that you're doing. So in my own focus on the global challenge, the human dilemma, whatever we want to call it, this encounter with you is significant to me. And it is my prayer that we find ways to continue the engagement, because I feel I have so much to learn, and I feel your voice in this is, as you say, you're just trying to figure it out. You're not, and I'm not overpraising you. I'm just simply expressing a sense that your voice in this dialogic process brings something very fresh and useful to me to the table. So, what closing thoughts would you offer about where we've gone today?
So, this might be uncomfortable, but I think maybe what would be worth doing is talking about the idea of identity politics and race for a second. It might be a good way to close, because I think a lot of the elements of what we're talking about merge into this, and it's just a very uncomfortable topic for people.
That's good.
And especially in the sort of wake of this Jordan Peterson sort of phenomena, yeah, is that okay with people? Do you want to talk about? Okay, so and it does tie many threads in this sense, which is we're now at this place where it's also just to say a political responsibility, right? In the sense that I'm a brown man, so I'm going to use my privilege as somebody who's non-white to talk about whiteness, but not in a form of education, but because what else would we talk about right now? In that sense, right? and also to say that the context of this room, where there is majority white room, and for many people that's uncomfortable, and it shouldn't be, and that the sort of Jordan Peterson reaction, for those who don't know, is he's a Canadian psychologist who kind of became this YouTube phenomena, and he pretends to be quite rationalist, but he's not rationalist. He's deeply misleading and manipulative, and the thing is, he's right about some things, and actually many things. And what happens with people on the left and feminists and people of color is that they completely reject him. And they say, he's a racist and he's inciting race wars, and, the only people that listen to him are young white Trump supporters. And that's also true to a certain extent. But we also have to understand how deeply seductive what he's saying is. It's the same reason we have to understand how deeply seductive capitalism is, and how deeply seductive the idea of entrepreneurialism is. And these are seductive ideas. And so why is it seductive? So what he's basically saying is like, you, young white male, are not to blame. You are under attack. And so there's this idea that of sort of self-pity. Actually, they're right. No, the immigrants are taking our jobs, and our opportunities are not created, and the feminist movement is emasculating me, and this sort of reaction. And that is going to be one reaction if we, as sort of allies, don't sort of get our house in order, let's say. And so maybe the starting premise of this is like, this is not sort of white versus non-white, capitalist versus non-capitalist, etc. This is our options as a civilization are this: growth or life. That's it. We continue to grow a global economy that is destroying all life, or we are on the side of life. Right. So that's premise one. So premise two is that by acknowledging our incarnations and our privileges, we are honoring our ancestors. The point of bringing up whiteness, and it's not done well, especially by people of color, is not to reify your whiteness, because there's no spiritual point in that. The point of this work is to transcend the subject-object duality, right? To get beyond the idea of the other. That's what we were supposed to be doing. And that's what happens when you stop separating spiritual work and political work. These things are not separate. The idea that you could separate spirituality, politics, economics, this is just an illusion, right? All of these things are deeply interconnected. Just like our crisis is not a climate crisis, it's a spiritual crisis and cultural crisis, a crisis of identity, a crisis of meaning. And so then we come to the next sort of point in this ladder, which is we have to acknowledge the incarnations we have chosen. And there's a spiritual normative bend on that, which is the point of acknowledging the fact that you have chosen to incarnate as a white male or a white woman or a brown man is to honor the fact that there was a decision on some higher plane, on some spiritual level, that occurred. And so you're not hiding from it, and you're not using it as either a crutch or an alibi. You're using it as just a recognition of fact in the material realm to enter the non-dual realm. And what it does when you say to other people that, yes, I know I acknowledge that I've incarnated as a white male, for example, is you're from a mimetic framing perspective, you're framing them into a spiritual frame, not a identity frame. And then the next thing is to acknowledge that capitalism does have structural drivers of violence. That capitalism is based on genocide and oppression and violence, and essentially a head start for Western Europeans who invented debt-based capital. And it's not a Western European, even when I was talking about Wetiko, it's not a Western European versus non-Western European thing anymore. It's globalized. So memes are like the cultural equivalent of genes. They're just ideas. So ideas like cannibalism, ideas like the invisible hand, ideas like trickle-down economics, ideas like perpetual growth on a finite planet, these are just ideas. And so when we disidentify from the idea, we disidentify with our ability to be part of that. And it doesn't mean we don't take responsibility. But what happens when you say to a person of color, I understand capitalism is a form of, or a woman, let's say, as someone who identifies as female, I understand capitalism is born out of patriarchy because of the historical circumstances we talked about earlier. Hierarchy was enmeshed. We rewarded certain type of behavior. We then said there's no other way to acquire goods and services except this money that we invented. So of course there's going to be a privilege to men. Of course there's going to be a privilege to white people. Capitalism is a form of white supremacy. That's why it's the sort of war it is. That's why we incarcerate black people. That's why we, into a privatized prison pipeline. So just by acknowledging that, what we do in all of our spaces is we just broaden the tent. People are much more willing to sit down and hang out with you and go to your spaces when they know you understand the reason for their plight and oppression. That's the only reason to understand. I'd say that's a major reason to understand capitalism. Of course, your own liberation being the main reason, because if you don't understand the oxygen which is suppressing you, you're not going to be able to get out of it. You're going to go to ideas that are not commensurate to the problem, like conscious capitalism. But when you understand how the system actually works, which is not that difficult, you just look around you, you sort of free yourself from that. And then the conversation can start. And the reason to presence whiteness is not to make white people feel insecure. And I think a lot of people of color don't understand that. And they're acting out their own wounds and their own trauma on other people who are, like we said, when you access reality at its highest level, you realize there's only one of us here. And we've chosen to play these roles. And if we can come at this from this non-dualistic, more mystical approach, I think we're going to have way different conversations around identity. And it's the same with funders, right? When I meet a funder who's so-called aware, we say to each other, I know you're playing the role of somebody who has money in this incarnation, and I'm playing the role of somebody who knows people who need it. It's a much more honest dialogue because now I'm not commodifying them. And this is why the embodiment conversation is so important, right? Because I could go be a post-capitalist activist, and then I go to funder meetings and I'm manipulating them and lying to them and telling them how I did X and then Y happened when I don't even believe in linearity or cause and effect in that way, and I'm commodifying them. And as soon as I commodify them, I'm polluting the morphogenetic field of our relationship. And so this is why this same sort of approach, we can approach identity with, we can approach gender with, we can approach sexuality, preference, all of those things, which is the primary process is the spiritual process. Let's just be clear about that. Even if I'm in a room with rationalist, lefty activists who believe in historical dialecticism, I will say the spiritual process is the primary process. We are all part of a divinity that is becoming self-conscious and self-aware and is being created through the very act of us gathering in this way. And to pretend otherwise is insane. And I'm not against science. So you've heard me say a lot of things about rationalism. Science is the floor of understanding, not the ceiling. I agree with the basic premises of what science is. It's also a method. It's not an ideology, even though they treat it like an ideology. And so I'm not against science. I just treat it as a floor of understanding. It helps. It's one language in making sense of the world in this way. But as soon as we see it as the ceiling, the highest aspect of our knowledge, we're essentially amputating all that other aspect of us that is in the knowing. And then the last thing to say is about ancestors. So I've said the word ancestors 2 or 3 times in this conversation, and I feel people who come from Western Europe who were forced to come here and flee their homes, and the wound, and let's say the wound before that of being in forced conversion from paganism to Christianity, and the cutting off of the ancestral lineage there is visceral. You feel it. Just saying the word ancestor, most white people feel uncomfortable because they say, well, I don't have a relationship to my ancestors. And the way you talk about ancestor is different than the way I talk about ancestor. And what I'd say to that is, ancestor does not have to be a literal understanding of ancestor. If you look at the way indigenous people talk about totems, their totems, right? Like let's say the Haida, for example. You'll go to a Haida home or community and there'll be a totem, and you'll say, well, explain that totem to me. And they'll say, that's where we come from. So that eagle in the middle of the totem, that's where my mom's family comes from. They're the eagle tribe. So the natural world can be your ancestor if you identify in that way. And I'll give you just another cosmology as an example. And I say this partly to say that it's so important that we reclaim our ancestors and we reclaim the lineage with which we came, because it's an important omen and clue in this spiritual political work. To completely amputate it because we're uncomfortable, because other people bring the idea of ancestorhood into our field in a way that does not resonate with us, doesn't mean we should ignore it, because then we're not doing the karmic redemption work we need to do. So I'll give you just one more example of cosmology, which is the ancient Egyptians believed that we had both star ancestor DNA and physical ancestor DNA. And there was a negotiation among these two DNA lines. So your star ancestors picked the line that you came into, and they said, well, that line has this type of karma: slave owner, slave, oppressed, oppressor, whatever. And this body will be a useful body. This context that they're being born into, Nairobi or Bolinas or whatever. And that negotiation was a merger between two very powerful ancestral forces. But the Star Nation ancestors were the kind of dominant ancestral force. So it's more important than your physical DNA lineage. So it's another cosmology to say, we do need to reclaim these concepts in whatever way is relevant to you. But if we don't, we're going to be orphaned. And to be orphaned or to have one aspect of ourselves amputated is not very useful to a world in revolution. And if we look at the way science looks at DNA, we understand about 7% of DNA since the Human Genome Project, since 2000. And they call 93% of our DNA junk DNA. And they're now understanding that this so-called junk DNA has a very powerful electromagnetic resonant field. And so it could be our ancestors are just living within us through a non-materialist resonant field. And that's the way this redemption of karma works itself out. And who's to know? I don't pretend to know. All I'm saying is that this is an important part of the inquiry. And we can't really have these full conversations around identity unless we're having these conversations on what lineage are we holding, whether it's in the seen or the unseen. And when we talked about Eros earlier, maybe Eros is one indicator where our attention goes, where our desire goes, and how our desire and our Eros is in relationship to the more than human world, the so-called natural world. There's also something very powerful in that coming together that we perhaps should be in inquiry of.
Alnoor Ladha, thank you for being with us at the New School.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for your work.